to another Todd Talk, where we take teaching theory and turn it into teaching practice. So what we're going to be talking about today is measuring what matters with gifted students, specifically with your WEP goals. So when you write WEP goals, you have to have a SMART goal, okay? And there's lots of aspects of SMART, but measurable is the one that really stands out. So let me ask you this question. What goals do you have as a teacher for students coming through your class? I want to take a minute to think about this. You can discuss with someone next to you if you want to, but what goals do you personally have for students coming through your class? You say, I definitely want them to get this, or I definitely want them to learn this. So think about that for a second, and then we'll get some responses. All right, can I get some volunteers to share what they came up with in their thinking process? Any volunteers? Any voluntold? Yes, please.
I want them to get curious.
Okay, so you want them to be curious. That's a great goal. It's a great goal. What are other goals that you may have? Yeah?
Learn to self-assess.
Learn to self-assess. Excellent. That way they can get better on their own without needing the teacher to always be helping them do that. Excellent goal. Other goals that you may have for your students? Yeah, please.
As I was talking to my colleague here, one of the things that I like to do is tell kids that I'm a math teacher and it's not scary. And I try to present it in a way that is not as scary as a lot of people make.
So your goal is to make math accessible to them.
Yeah.
And so they don't see that. Yeah, and that can be difficult because some students have mindsets of math is scary or math is really difficult or I can't do math. I was definitely one of those kids as well. So I appreciate that. I'm sure your students do as well. Any other goals out there? All right. So, oh yes, please, go ahead. So to make them independent thinkers and learners. Another excellent one, because when they leave our classroom, when they go out into the real world, we want them to be able to think for themselves. I think if COVID showed us anything, it's that we don't have a lot of independent thinkers because they've been in school and they've been having everything given to them or provided or walked through for them. And then when they had to independently work on their own, there were many students that struggled with that. But what I want you to, so even if you didn't volunteer, I want you to think about your goal for a second and then answer this rhetorical question, this follow-up question. Do you write WEP goals that reflect this? So are your WEP goals tied into what your personal goals are for your students? Or, like I see a lot of teachers do you just tie it to like they will get an 85% on this test or whatever, blah, 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 blah. It's measuring their math skills, but it's not really personalized. It's not a personalized goal, and it's not really what, you want them to learn that, but you want them to learn other more important things as well. If they forget how to get an 85% on that particular math, they're going to be fine in the world. But if they don't know how to independently think, if they don't know how to, self-assess, if they don't know how to do those things, then that's where it's going to be a problem. So, let me tell you the story of the jerk. So, now I'm not going to use any names because I want to be confidential. So I had this principal, his name was Darren. And Darren was someone who was not necessarily a friend to gifted. I remember the very first meeting I had where he was introducing me to his staff because I was the gifted pullout person. And he said to his staff in front of me, the curse that we put on these kids when we identify them as gifted. And I knew it was going to be a rocky relationship with Darren. And so when I wrote WEPs that talked about social emotional learning, I talked about independent thinking, about independent learning, I talked about being a leader, I talked about I individualized these because these were students, I would see something in them and I think they can do this, let's set this as a goal. So I hand these goals over to Darren, he has to sign them as the principal, and Darren says, I'm not signing these. I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, well, I'm not signing any of these, they're not measurable. And I'm like, they are measurable. I use student conversations, I use interviews, I use rubrics. I needed to come down to a number. It has to come down to a number or I'm not going to sign it. And so as a result, I went back and rewrote my WEPs to say students will get an 85% on their math assessment, or students will, and they were not very inspiring goals for me as a teacher. They were not very inspiring goals, more importantly, for our students, or my students. And so after that, I learned how to try to make hard to measure skills more measurable. Because one thing I learned in the classroom, and you may have learned this as well, is that at the end of the day, if students forget the content that you teach in your class, they can get by in life just fine. So I taught social studies. If kids didn't remember that the Twin Rivers were in Mesopotamia, where the Euphrates and I don't remember the other one offhand, that they don't remember the name of the Twin Rivers, they're going to be just fine. They're not going to get in a job interview and someone's going to say, name the Twin Rivers. They're not going to have a potential date say, I'll go out with you if you can tell me the name of the Twin Rivers. Never going to happen. So it was more important to me to teach them skills that they would use in their lives. And so 21st century skills, I know we're in 2022, but 21st century skills are skills that I wanted students to be able to leave my classroom saying that they knew how to do. Because the reality is this, we can no longer prepare kids for jobs because the jobs are ever changing. So right now, the top 10 jobs that exist in our country didn't exist 20 years ago. So how can we prepare them for jobs that don't exist? And a lot of jobs, like I just was in my Five Below the other week, and I realized they'd replaced all the cashiers with self-checkouts. And they had one person that was monitoring it. So those types of jobs are getting automated. And those types of jobs are fewer than they once were. And so I thought it was really important to be able to teach students 21st century skills that they could apply any job they went to. It was funny, I was at a pizza place picking up a pizza, and they had a sign that says hiring people right now. And I figured, like most people, pizza places just want someone with a pulse. They don't need, but on there it said, we want people that can collaborate. We want people that can problem solve. We want people that can think critically or communicate. All the 21st century skills that I think are important in the classroom. So what I'm going to be talking about are what are some things that we might want to think about measuring, and how might that goal look? So again, the problem about these 21st century skills, all these things, is they're very difficult to measure. So keep in mind, your goals should reflect, though, what you think is powerful learning in your classroom. So we used to do this activity called Bet Your Paycheck. And I would do this with staffs, and I would say, okay, what are 5 things you would bet your paycheck that your students know by the time they finish your class? Very rarely was it tied to content. It was usually tied to those things that you all shared and that I've been talking about. SMART goals do not need to come down to a number. They do have to be measurable, but you can measure them in other ways. There are creative ways to measure some of these 21st century skills, and I'll give you some examples of that. Don't discount the power of teacher observation. I know in today's day and age of data that we rely on the data, and the data is so important, but you are so important as well. And what you see in the classroom, and the growth that you see in students. Because the assessment may not properly assess the growth that your student truly had in your class. But you see that, and you know that, and so it's really important to not discount your own ability to observe what's going on in the classroom. Just because something is easy to measure doesn't mean it's worth measuring. So keep that in mind. So I'm going to share another story, which is that we should not force data. And let me give you an example. So we have a gifted pull-out magnet program. And we have 4th, 5th, and 6th graders on this, and we were really focusing on 21st century skills with our students. But we needed to pre-assess them to see what they knew, and then we did a lesson over a course of many weeks, and then we gave them a post-assessment to see that they learned it. And so one of the skills that we wanted to teach was collaboration. So we created a 10-question multiple choice test, pre-assessment, on what does it mean to be a good collaborator, to collaborate with others. What does that look like? And so the students took the test, and we looked at the data, And the teachers all said the same thing, which is that the people who got the highest scores are the worst collaborators. So that is a test that definitely did not measure the actual skill. It measured the knowledge of that skill. So I know it's important when you're collaborating to listen to others, but do I listen to others? I know it's important that if I'm going to problem solve, that failure is okay. But am I willing to try to go big and experience that failure? So just be aware that when you're measuring these skills, you want to make sure that whatever assessment you're using to do so measures it properly. So if I'm going to measure collaboration, I'm going to give you an example of a goal, but I'm going to look for things, do they collaborate well? When I put them in groups, what do they do? Do I keep track of that? Do I make observations? Do I use different things to keep track of their collaboration? So I'm going to give you 10 examples of WEP goals that are tied to skills that you may not feel can be measured at times or might be difficult to measure, and what that might look like on your WEPs. So the first one I've already talked about was collaboration. So again, you're not going to give them a pencil to paper test on collaboration and get whether they can collaborate or not. So instead, you could do something like this. Meyer will work well with others on group assignments, as evidenced by self and peer evaluations of his performance. So I did this with students when they would collaborate, because I thought collaboration was really important. They always got to evaluate themselves and their peers at the end of a unit of study. And actually, I started to find out that if I waited to the end, the self and peer evaluations were reflective of what their grade was. So if the kids got an A on their project, they were like, oh, great, you were great, you were great, you were great, you were great. But the reality was that so-and-so may not have been so great, but everyone got a good grade, so they're happy. Same thing if things went wrong. So if you got a C on your group assignment, and one person worked really hard, but you're sore because everyone got C's, you may not accurately reflect that. So I started taking snapshots. So every couple of days, I would have kids pull out their self-peer evaluations, and I had columns on there. And I would say, for the last couple of days, I want you to evaluate yourself and your group mates. And they would do that on a scale of A, B, C, D, F. We would talk about what that looked like and what those different levels meant. And they would take a snapshot. And then a couple of days later, they'd take another snapshot. And then a few days later. And so by the end of the project, we would have like 6 or 7 snapshots that we could average together. Because what would happen sometimes is a student would be really good at first in the project, but then when they got in that middle part, they'd start to wane. Or the student may start kind of slow, but then really pick it up. And so this captured that, these self and peer evaluations. So I used these when I was writing WEPs. So I would say, so-and-so scored this in the first couple of 9 weeks. The second 9 weeks, they scored this. And so I can show through measured that they improved as a collaborator. Critical thinking is really important, especially for our gifted kids. So someone mentioned, like, I want to make sure that they're independent thinkers, that they can think about things without someone having to point them in that direction or prod them, but it just comes to them. And so a goal that you might have is Mary will demonstrate enhanced critical thinking skills by engaging in the cognitive thinking process. So that obviously has been taught in the class and something that the student can look to as a structure. We will know she accomplished this by a rubric for student performance. So rubrics are a great way to capture skills and performances because it's based on observations, but the rubric does need to be written well. It needs to be written as objectively as possible so that when you give a grade, it measures what it's trying to measure. So one thing I would not suggest when you're making rubrics is going on to a program like Rubistar, which I don't know if anyone in here used, but it's an online program. You kind of plug in what you're doing, and it creates really cruddy rubrics that don't really define what students are doing or show what it looks like. So it would say, student did a great job, student did a good job, student did a fair job. I don't know what the difference is between those. And so you need to write rubrics that are truly measuring what it is that you want to have measured. Leadership is one I used all the time because I had students that were very passive. When they got into groups, they kind of blend, or they kind of faded into the background. They didn't want to take a leadership role. And I'm not saying that every kid has to be a leader. If you have too many leaders, actually, then you get Congress, which is, we don't want that. So, but when you have students, you do want them to have leadership qualities so that they are not someone who is being told what to do all the time or waiting for someone to tell them what to do. And so if you have a student who is not showing leadership qualities, you might have a conversation with them. Well, I noticed this and this and this. Do you think in this next one that you might take the lead on this? Or do you think in the next one that you might be the one that is, so I had specific roles in the groups. So I may have them be the overseer of everything. So would you be willing to do that role this time so that you can take on those leadership aspects? And so I wanted to have that conversation with the student about what I observed and what I saw, and then they knew I was paying attention when things, a lot of times I walk in the room and it doesn't seem like I'm paying attention, but I'm always observing, I'm always seeing what's going on, and then I try to have conversations based on what I saw. Almost immediately, I try to give them immediate feedback on what I'm seeing without embarrassing them in front of others. So one that you could do is, when given the opportunity, Freddie will decide to step into a leadership role and provide guidance for others as discussed in student conferences. So when I sit down and have a conference with Freddie, I'm going to see what did you do this time for leadership? Why didn't you do that? Or what could you do to be better in that? And so I'm having those conversations and I'm getting an idea of where Freddie is on that. Because again, I'm not going to evaluate leadership on a pencil to paper test. You can say what makes a good leader, it doesn't make you a good leader. So you have to, it's through your actions, and so we need to be able to observe those actions. Another one is kindness and empathy. We have some gifted students in our programs that lack empathy. Matter of fact, they can be downright crass. And a lot of times, it's not like they're doing it to be mean. It's just, they've always, the first thing that pops in their head is what they say, and so it doesn't seem like they're being empathetic. And so I think it's really important to teach kids what are qualities of kindness. So I can tell you to be kind. What does that mean? So if I notice someone doing an act of kindness, I'm going to make sure that I know that, I really appreciate you helping so-and-so pick up their books when they fell on the ground. Or I noticed that you stayed after class and helped so-and-so. I really appreciate that. But how do we get kids that don't do those things? How do we get them to recognize the traits of kindness and to try to be more kind? And so you might have a goal like this. When the moment presents itself, Anna will show more empathy towards fellow students. This increase will be determined by teacher observations. So if I observe Anna in this case, not showing empathy or kindness when there's an opportunity to do so, I might have that conversation with her. Well, I noticed this. Do you think you could have handled that better? The next time that situation comes up, how might you approach it instead? And so through my teacher observations, I can measure, by the end, I can see, Anna is now helping people without being asked, or she's being more kind to people when the situation arises. Because one thing I will say, even though there are some that are not empathetic, I also find that gifted students or there are some that are really empathetic. Like I would sometimes, and I know you've all done this as well, I would teach when I was sick. So I would come in and I don't feel well, but it's more of a hassle to do sub-plans than it is just to come in and teach. So I would teach and I wasn't feeling well, but I didn't say, hey, I'm not feeling so hot, and I wouldn't act like I wasn't feeling well. But it was always interesting because students always came up and said, Mr. Stanley, are you feeling well? Like they could sense it. It was just like a sixth sense. And so we want to take those kids and use them as role models. We don't want to say, hey, see when they did that, but we want to say, we want to make, thank that person individually and maybe point out, when you notice when so-and-so did this, that's something you might want to consider. Time management, the dreaded time management. How do we manage our time? And how do we manage our time in a structure where we are managing their time all the time? How do students manage that time for themselves? So what this looks like a lot of times is when you ask a student to study for a test, they wait to the last minute and they study the night before. That's not studying, that's cramming. And so how do we teach kids how to properly study? How do we say, okay, if you're going to study something, cramming it, you're going to remember it for the test, but you're never going to remember it after that. So so I had to work with my daughters on this, like how do you sit down and how do you actually study? rather than just cramming. So time management comes down to how do you spend your time so you don't have to wait till the last second. And I'll tell this story about time management. So my older daughter was in honors ELA in the 9th grade. And the only difference in the honors ELA and the regular ELA was the due date. So honors ELA had assignments due on Sundays, and the regular class had them due on, or the regular ed class had them due on Tuesdays. And so my daughter would come home on a Friday and say, do you have any work to do this weekend? She goes, yeah, I have to have this paper that's due. It's due on Sunday, and I have to work on it this weekend. I'm like, great. So Friday night would come around, and I'd say, have you started working on your paper yet? And she'd be like, no. And so Saturday would come around, and I would say, okay, have you surely started working on your paper by now? And she's like, no, haven't gotten to it yet, just thinking about it right now. And then Sunday would roll around, I'd ask the same thing, get the same response. And then about 11:13 at night, it was due at midnight, she would get up from whatever she was doing, and she would go in the other room, and she would spit out a paper, and she would submit it at 11:59. And every time she did that, she got an A. And so I just said, just once, I want her to crash and burn. I want her teacher to say, this is terrible work, this is an F, whatever. But what she was learning was that she can wait to the last minute and do something. And this is a very dangerous thing to learn, because she got to college and she did these same things and found out it doesn't work that way at college. You can't wait to the last minute and do these assignments. And so I'll call her now and she'll say, oh, I have an assignment due in 2 weeks. I'm like, oh, have you gotten started? She, oh, I'm almost done. So you notice this change in her, but some kids don't recognize that change they need to make, and so as a result, they struggle when they get into college. So we want to be able to show kids how to manage their time. And so one example would be, by the end of the school year, Rhea was scored 95% or higher on 3 or 4 of 4 independent reading projects, as demonstrated on a rubric. So independent projects definitely take time management. They require that the student manages their time well if they're going to, they're going to complete it. And so you could use something like that to measure. The next skill is grit or perseverance. And this is something I notice in gifted kids they lack, actually, quite a bit. So I talked this morning about the difference between a high achiever and high ability. There's a difference. Sometimes there's some people who are high achievers that are also high ability, and vice versa. Okay? But there are a lot of gifted students that aren't high achievers. They don't have the grit because things at the beginning of their schooling career were very easy to them. They already knew quite a bit, so things came easy to them. And so when a question was asked, they knew the answer. The high achievers don't know the answer, and they have to look it up, or they have to try to find it somewhere, or whatever. And so they're learning grit from a very early age. But something that happens with gifted kids, all gifted kids, is that eventually it catches up with you, and you're not going to have the answer really easy. And the problem is when that doesn't happen until 7th grade, or it doesn't happen until you're a junior in high school, or as it happened with me, it didn't happen until I was a freshman in college. It does catch up with you, and if you have not learned how to cope with that, if you've not developed skills to work around that, then you're going to really struggle. And so that's why I think it's really important to teach gifted students grit. That it's important to teach them that the answers don't always come so easy. And if they don't come so easy, what is your plan B? What is your plan C? So on and so forth. And so you might write something like this. Using the grit scale on the Panorama survey, Manny will increase from a 1 to at least a 3. I'm not sure if you have Panorama in your districts, but it is an SEL tool that we use in ours, and there are other ones that you can use as well. Angela Duckworth, the author of the book Grit, which is an excellent book. If you've not read it, I highly recommend it. But she has on her website a grit scale, and there are 10 questions, and kids will answer those questions, and it gives them a number, 1 through 5. And this does actually, unlike the one I talked about before where they were evaluating how well kids collaborated, this grit scale does a pretty decent job of evaluating whether kids have grit or not. And so you could look at their first couple results and then compare that with how it ends up at the end. This always happens. Okay. So the next one that I want to talk about after grit. Is task prioritization. So task prioritization is, what do you do first? When you have to do work, what do you do first? Most kids want to do what's fun. Or when they get home and it's like, do your homework. And they're like, no, I want to watch YouTube for 3 hours first, and then I'll do my homework later. And so this is task prioritization, is making sure you're putting the most important tasks first and then accomplishing those. And there's a couple of ways to do it. So some students will say, I'm going to pick the easy tasks first and do those, and then build up. Or I'm going to tackle the most difficult ones first, and then they'll be easier as I go along. And neither way is incorrect. But they do need to prioritize their task and what they need to do, rather than putting things on the list that maybe don't belong. So I know when I was getting ready for this PD, I was preparing the PowerPoints, whatever, and then I would get distracted by something that wasn't due for like a month, or something I wasn't even due. And I would get distracted by it, and I'm like, no, this is tomorrow, you have to do this. So I was working on this PowerPoint until 2 days ago. And so I needed to prioritize my task a little bit better. And so, but imagine what a student goes through when they're working on work and they're supposed to do something and they get distracted. And they don't have to be ADHD to be distracted. You can be distracted by a lot of things. Your phone, if you have your computers, there's the temptation. I'm sure there might be people right now shopping on Amazon. And so, at this very moment. And so, you may get distracted by things, and that happens. But are you prioritizing your task? Do you let yourself get distracted? Maybe a little, but you get back to the task at hand, or you just let it. And like if you, or like me, I get on Wikipedia and then go into a deep dive into ridiculous things that I shouldn't be looking at. So task prioritization could look like this. By the end of 7th grade, Anthony will display appropriate and effective personal qualities as a responsible, self-directed learner, and task prioritization is evidenced through teacher and student quarterly interviews. So I can interview him and say, hey, I noticed this about you, Anthony. What do you think about that? Or I noticed that you're getting better at this, or I noticed that you're regressing in this. And so having those conversations, these interviews, are a way to see how they're doing and to measure what they're doing. It doesn't have to be a number, but it does need to be like noted. Okay, he was here during the first 9 weeks, he's here the second, and we're seeing progress, or we're not seeing progress. Initiative. How often do your students take initiative, or do they have to be told what to do all the time? And so we want kids that don't wait for someone to tell them what to do. We want kids to say, okay, I need to do this, so I'm just going to go ahead and do it, rather than wait for, but a lot of times, students are waiting for us to tell them what to do. And so I think it's really important that they learn initiative. And so a goal might look like this. Turner will show more initiative when it comes to follow steps for assignments and getting work completed. This will be determined by the number of times the teacher has to ask him to do something as compared to when he does things on his own. And do you have to have a tally sheet and marking every single thing? Not necessarily, but you do want to make sure it's not anecdotal. So what I mean by that is you say, well, I think I remember him like last 9 weeks he was like you need to make a note, like when I saw him I noticed this, or he's asking me a bunch of times, or just jotting down on a Post-it note and putting it in somewhere where you can go to it later. But just keeping track of that over the course of a year, rather than relying on your memory to remember, well, I think he was like this last time, because that can sometimes not be very accurate. So I had places where I could keep track of things like this, and keep, not tallies, but like where I could put comments, well, I noticed this, or I noticed that. Public speaking is one I think is really important to teach students. I did this with 3rd graders, I did this with 7th graders, I did this with seniors in high school. And I actually teach online. I teach kids from China who speak really good English, probably better English than I do, but I teach them how to publicly speak, because it's so valuable. If you look at the skills that people are looking for employees coming into their workforce, public speaking is at the very top. They're not looking for skills, content skills. They're looking for people that can talk well. Because here's the reality is that there are more people afraid to publicly speak than they are of dying. And so Jerry Seinfeld once told the joke, like, that means that when you're at a funeral, most people would rather be in the casket than giving the eulogy. And so we want to make sure that we make kids more confident, because that's all it is with public speaking. That's why people are afraid of it, because they're not confident in it. And so the more they do it, the more confident they're going to be. So as much as possible, I try to give my students opportunities to speak publicly. Not just in discussion, but teaching the class, or doing assessments, or like performance assessments where they presented something. And so how you might evaluate that, and how I did, was Marika will demonstrate effective communication through oral presentation of researched information by earning a 90% or higher on 3 out of every 4 assignments by the end of the 6th grade. So when I had a performance assignment, I would take note, like how well did she do on her public speaking? You know, what was the grade? Did it reflect her, and more importantly, did it reflect her public speaking ability? And so I could evaluate that way. Information literacy. This is just a fancy term for research. So do students know how to research? And I'll give you an example of a pet peeve I have, which is that I'll talk to some students and they'll say, well, I'm not allowed to use Wikipedia. The teacher says we're not allowed to use Wikipedia. And why this is a pet peeve of mine is because it seems like the easy way out. Rather than teaching them how to properly use Wikipedia and go down to the bottom and look for footnotes and follow some of those things and look for reliability, we're just saying don't use it at all. So shouldn't we be teaching kids how to determine for themselves whether something is reliable or not, whether something is worth, you know, your putting it into your paper or whatnot? And so I would rather say this is how you can use Wikipedia, because Wikipedia has some great stuff on it, but there are some that are definitely questionable. And so we teach them how to do that. And so I teach kids how to research. I mean, I only went down to 3rd grade, but I was teaching my 3rd graders how to do research, how to do a search on Google. Because, of course, the way a lot of kids do is you say, okay, I want you to search on the internet, and they put it in the Google, and then if it isn't in the first 2, they're like, I can't find anything. So do you teach them how to like put the proper phrasing in the search? Do you teach them how to go through and cull through, go down a few, because the first few are usually ads of some sort. Go down a few and then look into those. When I go to do research, I'll sometimes go down to the very bottom and click 3, so to advance me 3 pages ahead, rather than looking at the first few ones. And so you might have a goal like this. Raina will demonstrate growth in research skills, including the acquisition of knowledge, concepts, theories, application, and evaluation in selected areas of interest, such as mammals. So obviously they have a mammals project, and so this would tell me whether she could research or not, depending on how well she does on it, with 90% accuracy by the end of 5th grade. So taking opportunities where they have to use research, evaluating how they did, and then using that to show growth. So a couple things I want you to remember when we are looking at WEPs. So the first of which is that it's really important that you measure what it is that is important to you as a teacher. So what do you value that your students get? Because if you just rely on things that you don't value, then that's going to be challenging as a teacher to say, okay, they know how to do this, but I really want them to know how to do this. I mean, shouldn't those 2 things match? Shouldn't what the goal is that you're wanting, shouldn't it be worth measuring? Isn't it something that you want to do? Secondly, make sure you determine how you're going to measure it. There's lots of different ways to measure things, rather than just a pencil to paper test. Observations, rubrics, interviews, evaluations, surveys, all sorts of things that you can use to evaluate this. And I understand people are thinking, well, that sounds like a lot of work. But it's not really. So self and peer evaluations really take no work at all. It's the students doing it. So but just making those available to students to measure whether they're learning what it is that you want them to learn. And then lastly, as long as you have this, whenever you write a goal, as long as you have this in mind, you'll be in good shape, which is always do what's best for kids. So if you feel your goal, so if I had to go back to Darren, the jerk, and he told me he wasn't going to count that, I now, with what the knowledge I have and the more confidence, I would push back on him. And I would say, these absolutely are measurable. And I disagree with you. But I was young at that time, and I just did what my principal told me to do. But I didn't feel like I was doing what was best for kids when I was writing those other goals. And so I want to make sure that what I'm doing is what's best for my kids. So, as always, If you want to check out more Todd Talks, this one will be on there in the next month or so. But if you want to check out Todd Talks, they're on the website. I cover all sorts of things, not just gifted, but regular ed, how to set up your classroom, you know, different strategies that you can use with students that are not just gifted. So feel free to check those out. And I want to thank you for having me in today. And good luck with your WEP writing. I'm sure you'll do just fine. But again, keep in mind, you're doing what's best for your kids. So you can always follow me on Twitter. I only put that up there because I only tweet out stuff that has to do with education, strategies, maybe blogs that I've written or whatever, but I'm always like, it's always things for you, it's professional development rather than something that's social. So thank you so much, I really appreciate it, and good luck with your WEP writing today.